He said he was chosen by God. The women said he was their savior. The police called him something else entirely. A part takes process in the summer of 1956 in the lowlands of Tennessee, when a man named Grayson Moore appeared in Hollow Creek, a place so small it didn't exist on most maps. Locals remembered him as tall, pale, and almost unsettlingly calm. He spoke softly with a preacher's rhythm and claimed that he had walked through the fire of revelation and seen visions of the world's end. At first, people laughed. Then they started to listen. According to archived county records, Moore had no official past, no family, no social security number before 1955, no birth certificate under that name. The FBI would later note in a classified 1979 report that his fingerprints matched those of a failed seminary student from Alabama who disappeared after an arson fire at a church in 1954. But by the time those records were connected, it was already too late. Moore began preaching in barns and abandoned tobacco sheds, gathering a small crowd of drifters, widows, and disillusioned believers. He told them that God had spoken directly to him through the voice of thunder, commanding him to prepare a place for the chosen few, the daughters of the covenant. He claimed that only through him could they survive the coming purification of the world. Witnesses recall that his early sermons were haunting. He spoke not of heaven, but of cleansing. "The fire will come," he said, "and only the pure will burn bright enough to be seen by God." Within months, several women sold their homes, left their families, and followed him to a secluded patch of land outside Hollow Creek, 50 acres of overgrown farmland bordered by dense pine forest and a single dirt road. That land would become the foundation of what locals would soon call the Church of Women. The county sheriff, in an interview years later, said, "They came in quiet, but they built like they were preparing for war." The compound grew quickly. Cabins, fences, watchtowers, even a crude chapel assembled from salvaged wood and tin. Moore called it Eden Restored. Outsiders called it something else, a cult in the making. Rumors spread that Moore performed midnight baptisms in the creek, where the women wore white gowns and chanted verses that didn't appear in any Bible. Neighbors reported hearing screams at night, though no one could ever prove what happened beyond the fences. The local pastor of Hollow Creek Baptist, Reverend Eli Sanders, tried to confront Moore in 1958, but vanished 3 days later. His car was later found near the county line, keys still in the ignition. When asked years later about Sanders' disappearance, one of Moore's followers, a woman named Lila Dorsey, said something that would haunt investigators. "He went into the fire. That's what the prophet said must happen." By the early 1960s, Hollow Creek had changed forever. Mail stopped being delivered to the compound. Children were pulled from local schools. Women who joined the church were never seen in town again. And Grayson Moore, the man without a past, became a legend whispered in the dark. But according to the few who escaped, what began as faith soon turned into something much darker. Something that, decades later, would leave behind one of the most disturbing crime scenes in Tennessee history. The Church of Daughters. By 1962, the Church of Women had become a living organism, isolated, self-sufficient, and obedient. Members referred to themselves as the Daughters, and to Grayson Moore as the prophet of Hollow Creek. To outsiders, they were a commune. To those inside, they were a divine army. According to FBI transcripts and recovered letters, Moore had established strict rules. Women were forbidden to speak to outsiders, to leave the compound, or to question his teachings. Men were not allowed to join. He claimed that God had revealed to him that Eve's sin could only be undone by women's obedience to the true Adam, and that he, Grayson Moore, had been chosen to guide them back to purity. Every dawn, the daughters gathered in the clearing behind the chapel. They sang in unison, low, mournful hymns that mixed biblical verses with strange phrases like, "The flesh must be refined," and "The fire is truth." Each hymn ended with Moore's voice echoing through a loudspeaker. "You are my daughters of the flame, and I am the Word made flesh." He introduced rituals that blurred the line between devotion and submission. Women were required to confess impure thoughts in front of the group, kneeling as Moore placed his hands on their heads and whispered prayers. Some nights, he would choose one or two to enter the covenant, a private ceremony that survivors later described as both sexual and violent. Those chosen were renamed Ruth, Esther, Miriam, Deborah, the wives of divine purpose. Inside the chapel, investigators later found hundreds of burned pages from rewritten scripture, fragments of the book of Genesis and Revelation altered to center Moore as a messianic figure. One surviving page read, "And the daughters shall know his name and bear his light in their wombs." Visitors to the area began to vanish. A traveling salesman in 1964, two college students in 1967, all last seen near Hollow Creek. Locals whispered that the prophet had taken them as offerings, but without evidence, authorities could do little more than watch from a distance. Moore's control was total. Former members described how he dictated every aspect of life: when they could eat, when they could sleep, even when they could breathe. One woman, who escaped in 1971, told federal agents, "We didn't think anymore. We just waited for his words. When he said jump, we jumped. When he said burn, we lit the fire." The church grew to over 40 women by the late 70s. They wore the same handmade linen dresses, shaved their heads in devotion, and branded their wrists with the letters GC, God's chosen. Each believed she was one of the prophet's eternal brides. Each believed that the world outside had already been consumed by sin. According to local rumor, even the land itself seemed cursed. Crops grew wild, the air felt heavy, and animals refused to approach the fences. On moonless nights, neighbors swore they saw fires burning deep in the woods, circles of light, moving in rhythm, as if dancing. No one dared to get close. As time went on, Hollow Creek forgot where faith ended and fear began. And at the center of it all, calm, pale, and godlike, stood Grayson Moore, preaching a gospel that no one outside the compound could understand. According to declassified FBI records and the 1984 Hollow Creek Raid report, more than 40 women lived within the compound at its peak. Most of them arrived between 1958 and 1978, drawn from small towns across Tennessee, Kentucky, and northern Georgia. They were teachers, nurses, widows, and runaways. Some were deeply religious before they met him. Others were simply lost. Each, in her own way, was searching for something, and found instead the prophet. Among the earliest converts was Leela Dorsey, a 27-year-old schoolteacher from Memphis. Letters recovered from her parents' home show how her tone shifted over time, from excitement to obsession. In one letter dated July 2, 1958, she wrote, "He speaks like no one I've ever heard. When he looks at you, you feel seen, not as you are, but as you should be. We are preparing for the cleansing. It's beautiful here." After that, the letters stopped. Another was Mary Beth Caldwell, once a nurse at a veterans hospital in Nashville. According to witness statements, she met Moore at a revival gathering and followed him within a week. Her colleagues later told investigators that she had been struggling with grief after losing her son in a car accident. Moore convinced her the boy's soul could be reborn in the new Eden. The women lived under strict hierarchy. Those who had been in the church the longest were called the elders. They supervised prayer, food distribution, and discipline. Moore referred to them as my 12 flames. Survivors later claimed that the elders enforced obedience through isolation and fear. Punishments for disobedience included fasting, confinement, or public humiliation. Some described being forced to kneel in the creek for hours, as others recited verses over them. Daily life was regimented. They rose at dawn, tended the gardens, and prepared communal meals in silence. Moore's voice played from hidden speakers throughout the compound, recorded sermons repeating his commandments. Obedience brings light. Doubt brings fire. By nightfall, the daughters gathered in the chapel for confession and ritual cleansing. Former members said they barely remembered the outside world. The compound became the universe, and the prophet its son. Records indicate that the women surrendered their possessions and identities upon arrival. Driver's licenses, jewelry, photographs, all burned in a symbolic ceremony called the offering of flesh. Their hair was cut short and replaced with linen veils. Each received a new name drawn from scripture. One survivor told federal agents in 1984, he said, "Our old names belonged to the dead world. Only through his voice could we be reborn." A handful tried to leave. None succeeded without help from outside. One woman, identified only as Ruth in a 1984 court transcripts, escaped in 1971 by hiding in a supply truck delivering kerosene. She was found delirious on the side of a highway, covered in burns and muttering about the children in the barn. Her testimony became the first official warning that something sinister was happening behind the fences. In interviews years later, Ruth described the other women with eerie precision. They smiled even when they were starving. They believed every bruise was proof of God's touch. He didn't need chains. We were the chains. Despite multiple missing person reports, law enforcement struggled to intervene. Without direct evidence of criminal activity, Hollow Creek remained beyond their reach, and the women, most legally adults, refused all contact, claiming that they had chosen their lives freely. Spick. The sheriff at the time summed it up grimly. You can't arrest faith. You can only watch it burn. By the late 1970s, the outside world had all but forgotten the women of Hollow Creek. Their names faded from records, their families gave up hope. Only later, when agents entered the compound in 1984, would the full scope of what had happened there come to light, and the truth about the prophet's so-called children of light would finally emerge. By 1973, Hollow Creek was no longer just a commune. It was a world unto itself. The prophet began to speak of a new generation of purity, a line of children untouched by the corruption of man. To his followers, it sounded like salvation. To investigators years later, it sounded like something far darker. According to FBI testimony and coroner's reports filed after the 1984 raid, at least 23 children were born on the property between 1965 and 1982. None were registered with the state. Their names appeared only in Moore's private journals, where he referred to them not as sons or daughters, but as vessels of light. He told the women that these births were the fulfillment of divine prophecy, the restoration of Eden through his bloodline. Witnesses who later escaped described how the pregnancies were treated as sacred events. Once a woman conceived, she was separated from the rest, housed in a cabin called the Ark. No one was allowed inside except Moore and the elders. During labor, hymns were played through loudspeakers to drown out the screaming. When the child was born, Moore would lift the newborn toward the ceiling and declare, "The fire has found its shape." The newborns were raised communally. Mothers were not permitted to claim them as their own. The prophet said they belonged to God, one survivor told agents in 1984. The children were taught to read scripture before they could write their names. They memorized Moore's rewritten verses and called him Father of Light. But by the mid-1970s, something began to change. Witnesses reported that several infants disappeared soon after birth. Moore told his followers that the babies had been taken to heaven early. When pressed by his elders, he claimed that the unworthy vessels could not contain the light. No burials were ever found. Investigators later uncovered fragments of burnt bone in the remnants of the barn behind the chapel. Forensic reports were inconclusive, but consistent with infant remains exposed to high heat. One agent, speaking anonymously, said it was as if the place had tried to erase itself. Survivors recounted how the prophet's teachings became increasingly apocalyptic. He warned that the outside world was preparing to destroy them, that the government, the churches, and even the air itself were poisoned. The only hope, he said, was to purify the bloodline through faith and sacrifice. Prosody encapsulate. He began conducting nightly ceremonies he called the renewal. During these rituals, the women and children were gathered before a fire pit while Moore delivered sermons that drifted into delirium, claiming that the flames spoke to him in God's voice. One survivor, known in records as Miriam, described the moment she realized something was wrong. He said the next child would end the curse of Eve. He said the world outside was ending, and that if we left, our blood would turn to ash. She fled 2 weeks later and was found hiding near a gas station in Crossville, barefoot and clutching a burnt page torn from Moore's Bible. That page would later become one of the most disturbing artifacts in the case. It read, "When the daughters bring forth the sons of fire, the world shall see his light and tremble. The wicked shall not survive the dawn." Even now, decades after the compound was destroyed, no one knows what happened to many of those children. Only 3 were ever found alive, malnourished, unable to speak, and terrified of daylight. Psychologists who examined them described behaviors consistent with years of isolation and indoctrination. One of them, now an adult, later said in an interview, "We thought he was God. We thought the world outside didn't exist." For law enforcement, the question that lingered was not how the prophet created his following, but how so many people had vanished into Hollow Creek, never to return. Speak. The answer, as it turned out, lay buried beneath years of silence, waiting for the fire to come again. The morning of August 17th, 1984, began like any other in Hollow Creek. Thick fog, cicadas, and the faint hum of hymn music drifting from the compound. But by dawn, unmarked vehicles rolled through the woods, carrying nearly 40 federal agents, sheriff's deputies, and social workers. For almost 30 years, the Church of Women had existed beyond the reach of law. That morning, it came to an end. The operation was codenamed Project Eden. It was led by the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, working off an anonymous tip from a woman who had fled the compound weeks earlier. She claimed that the prophet was preparing for the final fire. Her account was so specific, mention of buried children, armed guards, and sealed cabins, that it triggered one of the largest rural raids in Tennessee history. Agents moved in before sunrise. They expected resistance. Instead, they found silence. The gates were open. Smoke drifted from the chapel chimney. When they entered, they discovered rows of women kneeling in the dirt, heads shaved, hands folded, whispering prayers. None of them screamed. None ran. One of the agents later testified, "It was like they'd been waiting for us, or for something worse." Grayson Moore was nowhere to be found. Inside the chapel, investigators found overturned pews, charred icons, and a handwritten note pinned to the altar. "The fire has come. The unworthy will see ash. The chosen will see light." Behind the main structure, they discovered what was later described as a mass burn site. Forensic teams unearthed fragments of human remains, mostly children, alongside melted glass jars, animal bones, and scorched religious texts. The smell, according to one agent's field report, hung in the air for days. The search continued across the property. In the barn, agents uncovered a recording setup, reel-to-reel machines still humming, dozens of labeled tapes. Each was marked with dates spanning 2 decades. They were sermons, prayers, and something else. Hours of Moore speaking to an unseen audience. His voice rising and fracturing as if slipping into another personality. One tape ended abruptly with the sound of fire crackling and a woman's scream. In total, 37 women and 3 surviving children were removed from the compound that day. Most were malnourished, dehydrated, and emotionally unresponsive. Medical teams documented ritual scarring, burns, and signs of long-term physical abuse. Many refused to give their real names, insisting they were daughters of the light and asking to be returned to Eden restored. Moore's body was never found. Rumors spread through the state that he had fled before the raid. Others claimed he had walked into the flames. One FBI agent privately suggested that his followers had cremated him in a final purification rite. No conclusive evidence was ever recovered. The site was declared a federal crime scene for 8 months. Locals who drove past the perimeter fence reported hearing music at night, faint female voices singing from the woods. The investigation eventually yielded hundreds of photographs, personal journals, and recordings that painted a picture of psychological domination unlike anything seen in the region's history. When the federal report was unsealed in 1989, it was missing 70 pages. Several key exhibits, including the final audio tape labeled The Renewal, were listed as lost during evidence transfer. The official explanation cited a warehouse fire, but former agents who worked the case believed otherwise. One of them, retired in 1992, summed it up in a single line. "We stopped the fire too late, and I don't think it ever really went out." The recordings discovered in the barn became the most chilling evidence in the Hollow Creek investigation. Over 80 reels were found, many warped by heat, some partially melted, but more than 30 were successfully restored by forensic technicians. Together, they spanned nearly 2 decades of the prophet's voice: sermons, prayers, punishments, and something deeper, something that defied classification. The first recovered tapes dated back to 1959, when the church was still young. Moore's tone then was calm, persuasive, almost hypnotic. He spoke softly, with long pauses, often addressing his followers as "my flames." He promised them a paradise cleansed by fire, a place where no man may lie, no flesh may rot. To the untrained ear, they sounded like any other rural sermon. But the further the tapes progressed, the more his words unraveled into madness. By the mid-1970s, the voice had changed. The tone cracked and shifted mid-sentence. He began to speak in plural. We, our, the voice through me. The sound engineers who transcribed the tapes noted moments when faint whispers overlapped his speech, though Moore was alone in the room. Several agents later admitted privately that they couldn't listen to the full recordings in one sitting. Tape number 44, dated April 3, 1976, is often cited in FBI psychological reports as the turning point. In it, Moore declares, "The daughters will bear the sons of light, and when the old fire dies, I will rise in them." Moments later, the audio distorts, followed by laughter, female voices chanting, and the unmistakable sound of crying children. The tape ends abruptly with a loud bang. One of the last tapes, labeled The Renewal, February 1984, was only partially playable. Investigators heard the prophet speaking rapidly, almost breathless, over the sound of flames crackling. "The fire is truth. The fire is home. When you see the ash, you will know that I am near." Then silence. No one has ever confirmed whether this final tape captured the moment before the mass deaths that occurred in the compound. It remains classified in redacted form to this day, though leaked transcripts circulated briefly in the early 1990s among journalists and occult researchers. What made the tape so disturbing was not only what Moore said, but what was heard underneath. Spectrographic analysis revealed overlapping frequencies that didn't match human voices. Experts suggested it could have been degraded tape layers or environmental interference. Others were less certain. One technician reportedly resigned after restoring tape number 52. In his final log entry, he wrote, "There's something behind him. It breathes when he pauses." The recordings also revealed the method of indoctrination. Survivors confirmed that Moore played them nightly through speakers hidden throughout the compound. Even when he was away, his voice filled every corner of their lives, in the fields, in the sleeping quarters, even in the chapel's floorboards. One woman described it as hearing God dream through walls. When excerpts were played during the 1985 hearings, jurors reportedly wept. A transcript from the session reads, "I can still hear him when I close my eyes. Not the words, the rhythm. It's like he's waiting for me to answer." Afterward, the FBI sealed most of the collection at Quantico. Only a few reels were ever released to researchers, all heavily edited. The rest, according to a 2001 internal memo, were transferred to long-term archival storage pending reevaluation. But locals near Hollow Creek still tell another story. Some claim that late at night, if you drive down County Road 9 and roll down your windows, you can hear faint voices carried on the wind, low, broken whispers, repeating a single phrase from those recordings. The fire is truth. The fire is truth. The fire is truth. In the decades since the raid, Hollow Creek has become a ghost, a scar half buried beneath the pines. The government bulldozed the compound in 1985, leaving only the stone foundation of the chapel and the scorched outline of what locals still call the Yard of Daughters. Grass grew over the graves, trees reclaimed the road, and yet the story never left. It lingers in whispers, in archives, in the minds of those who once believed. The surviving women were placed in rehabilitation centers across the South. Some changed their names and disappeared into new lives. Others never left institutional care. According to a 1991 Tennessee state report, fewer than 10 were able to reintegrate fully. They spoke little of Moore, referring to him only as he, a name they pronounced with reverence, even decades later. One woman told a psychologist, "You don't leave the fire. You just learn to live with the smoke." The children, now adults, have lived quietly under sealed identities. Journalists who tried to find them were threatened with legal action by federal authorities. Yet in 2006, a former agent confirmed that at least one child, now a woman in her 40s, still receives anonymous donations through a P.O. box registered in Knoxville. The money, sent every month without a return address, always includes a note written in the same style Moore used in his journals. The flame does not die. Religious scholars and psychologists have spent years studying the Church of Women as a case study in total control, the perfect fusion of charisma, isolation, and apocalypse. Some compare Moore to David Koresh or Jim Jones. Others argue he was something older, a type of American prophet born of loneliness and ruin. His sermons, recovered and cataloged under case file HC 223, are now used in behavioral training at Quantico, not as theology, but as pathology. Yet, there are still those who believe. Every few years, someone leaves flowers at the old Hollow Creek gate, 12 lilies tied with red thread. In 2012, locals reported a small group of women camping near the ruins, dressed in white, singing hymns that matched the melodies on the old recordings. When police arrived, they found the camp abandoned, fire still burning, and a phrase carved into a nearby tree: "The light waits." Even today, Hollow Creek remains a place of unease. Hikers claim their compasses spin near the chapel's foundation. Hunters speak of voices whispering through static radios. A journalist who visited in 2018 described hearing a faint hum, like an old reel-to-reel spinning somewhere underground. The official story ends with the raid. The prophet vanished, his church dissolved, his crimes recorded. But unofficially, something persisted, an idea, a rhythm, a faith that refused to die. In 2019, a burned tape labeled HC Last Sermon surfaced on an online auction site. It was traced to a retired FBI archivist who died before questioning. The tape was seized and classified within days. No copy was ever released. Those who studied the Hollow Creek case often repeat one unsettling truth: charismatic evil doesn't disappear, it changes form. The prophet may have burned in his own fire, or he may have walked into the woods. No one knows, but his voice, his rhythm, his words, they outlived him. As one former follower said before her death in 1997, "He told us that when the world forgets his name, the light will rise again in another." Maybe it already has. And somewhere in the pines of Tennessee, when the night is still and the wind moves just right, people swear they can hear it. That slow, hypnotic voice, whispering from the dark. The fire is truth, and truth always returns.